Hello and welcome to another episode of Twice as Lively with Ken Heckenlively. That would be me. And as always, I have my Pete's Coffee, a cafe Americano with a little bit of room for cream and honey. Because you always need a little sugar with your caffeine. So get your beverage of choice ready. It is just a little after 10 o'clock on the West Coast. And that means that pretty much everywhere in the continental United States, it is still the workday. So hopefully your adult beverage of choice has nothing stronger than caffeine in it, doesn't have alcohol. But if it does, I'm not going to be judgy with you because I'm not that kind of guy. I'm just relaxed. I'll be who I am, you be who you are. And did I mention, you're looking really sexy today. Did you lose some weight? Did you do something with your hair? Have you been dieting? Did you join a gym? Because you're looking really sexy today. Okay, so get that beverage ready. Go for that simultaneous sip. Here we go. So good. So good. All right, the title of today's episode, The Trump Doctrine. What I want to do is I want to give you my impressions about Donald Trump and why I feel that in the 10 years that he has been on the political stage, my opinions about him have stayed relatively the same. And I don't think that a lot of people genuinely understand the Trump view of the world. And maybe they do. Maybe that's why he really is one of the most talented politicians of our era. And even if you don't like him, I think you have to acknowledge that because no other person in American history has risen to the presidency without having some political or military position. The only people who I'd put in the same category as Donald Trump is somebody like Ulysses S. Grant, who ran the Union armies, Dwight Eisenhower, or General George Washington. But Trump didn't even do anything like that. So, zero military or political experience. So how did he do that? How did he, of all of the citizens of the United States, of all of the people who are in government, how did he become the top dog? And how has he weathered so many attacks? And he continues to do the job. Well, when Trump first came onto the scene, I said to myself, I get this guy. The reason I get him is because I feel like I've seen this show before in my own life. Hey, Carson, welcome to the program. Love to have you here. So, where have I seen this show before? Well, you may or may not know, but I come from a real estate family. So let me tell you a little bit of a story about how my family got into real estate. So the family story is that on my mother's side of the family, both my grandfather and grandmother were from Sicily. They didn't know each other in Sicily, but they lived nearby. And in fact, they had they had cousins in common. So the story goes that my grandfather came when he was relatively young, probably like 13 or 14 years old. So he'd been in the country significantly longer than my grandmother had. And so the story is that my grandmother came from money in Sicily. And what she wanted to do in the wake of World War One was she wanted to come to the United States to be educated. So her father was going to provide her money to go to college. And it was thought that she would become like a bookkeeper or do something like that because the family back in Sicily owned property. And so they were landlords in Sicily. I don't really know that much more about them, but let's just say that. So she comes to the United States and she stays with cousins who are unscrupulous, and they steal the money from her and say that any woman who goes to college is a whore. And they say that no, women shouldn't go to college. Women should work and then get married. And so, through a series of events, my grandmother ends up avoiding one marriage by marrying my grandfather, who she really hadn't talked to that much. But my grandfather was very much in love with her, knew that she was in something of a perilous position. And I've never quite gotten the story of how they worked out the early parts of their marriage, but they did seem to come to a very good arrangement. They loved each other. They were married until they died. They seemed to work very effectively together. But one of the things that my grandmother was very intent on was owning property. And so the first thing that they did in their marriage was that I believe my grandmother worked in a store, ended up buying a grocery store with my grandfather's help. She ran that for several years. What happened in immigrant communities in that time is that the grocery stores, local grocery stores would often have a safe where the immigrants could put their money and know that it would be well taken care of. And that was something because the big banks really did not cater to immigrants. So she got a reputation for trustworthiness. People liked her. And then she ended up, my grandparents ended up buying property. My grandfather was a mechanic and then an engineer. So he worked first for the fire department, then for a large company, Jubilee Manufacturing, in which he developed many products for them. And then he ended up working for the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II and for many years after that. So he had a stable job. And then my grandmother was really the entrepreneur. Okay. So that's sort of my family real estate background as best as I understand it. Now, there's something peculiar which happens to you when you own real estate that you rent out to people. And that is, you get to know people at a fundamentally different level. The level that you get to know people at is a pretty honest level, because when somebody is approaching you to rent their home from you, they pretty much have to tell you the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so a landlord gets a certain perspective on human beings, kind of like the same way a lawyer gets a certain perspective on people, a doctor gets a certain perspective on people. And that's something that always struck me about Trump, is that because of my family's real estate background, I could instinctively understand how he saw the world. Now, what are some of those things that Trump learned when he was young from his father, Fred Trump? Well, back in the old days, for rent, you had to go knock on doors. and collect it from people. This is something my grandparents did. So they got to know the people, and sometimes people were in trouble. Sometimes people were friendly, sometimes they weren't. One of the stories that appeared in a Rolling Stone magazine profile of Trump were memories from Trump of going to collect rent checks from their tenants. And what Fred Trump would do is he would knock on the door and then stand to the side. Why would he do that? Because sometimes people couldn't pay and they would get violent, and you might have somebody shoot through the door. Yes, that is the perspective you have when you're a landlord. I heard very similar stories when I was growing up because my grandparents usually lived in the buildings that they owned. So there might be, 15, 20 apartments in a building. My grandparents would take one of them so that, it's kind of like living above the store and everybody knows them. And there's not just that problem of collecting rents, but as a landlord, you are responsible for people's comfort. And so you learn to be a very hospitable human being. That's something that my grandparents did as well. And I think that they passed down to my mother and to my brother and me, which is we understand that just because we're the people who own the building doesn't mean we don't have responsibility to them. This is a relationship. The relationship is we make the people feel that this place is their home, and in response, they pay us money. So it's a good relationship that most of the time works out very well. This is something that I saw with Trump. And there is a perception among many that when you're a landlord, that means you're a tyrant. No, if anything, you have to be a hospitable person. You have to make people satisfied. You also have to figure out what's really going on. You don't want to let a problem sit and cost you a lot more money later. So this was a thing that I think that I sort of instinctively understood about a man like Donald Trump. There's another part of my family's history which made me feel like I instinctively understood Donald Trump. And that is that when you're a landlord, you kind of get to know the other landlords. And when I was growing up, the number one landlord in San Francisco was a man named Angelo San Giacomo. Angelo was a good family friend. It was actually kind of interesting how we got to know Angelo, because when my mom was going to USF, the father, who was the president of USF, tried to set my mom up with Angelo San Giacomo. And his reasoning was, you should go out with this guy, Angelo, because he's just like your grandmother. Okay. So, but they never went out. Okay. But my mom always heard about this guy, Angelo. Well, fast forward about 15 years later, my mom is married to my dad, and my dad goes and plays golf at Olympic Club. My dad was a big golfer, really always belonged to the best clubs. And so, just by happenstance, he gets paired with Angelo San Giacomo. So Angelo is on his way to becoming the largest landowner in San Francisco. He wouldn't have any properties outside of San Francisco. And there's a certain character to somebody who becomes a large landowner, which is they're usually highly individualistic, which is exactly what Angelo was. They like to see reality as it is, and then they act on it. And because they act correctly on it, they usually end up making money, which is what Angelo did. So Angelo and my dad, in playing golf, just really took to each other. I think because both Angelo and my dad could observe the tiny details that a lot of other people missed. So my dad was really, I think, an expert at looking at a situation and sizing it up. So I guess the story is that my dad started, pointing out some things on the Olympic Club golf course, which he thought weren't being done well. And it just resonated with Angelo. And so Angelo and my dad became really good friends. My dad ended up inviting Angelo over for dinner. They got talking, and my mom figured out, oh, you're the guy that Father Lo Schiavo wanted to set me up with when I was in graduate school. So it was kind of a funny thing that happened. Angelo was married at that time. His wife was Yvonne, a lovely woman. And so my parents became great friends with the San Giacomos. And in fact, if something had happened to my parents when my brother and I were young, our finances would have been handled by Angelo San Giacomo. So who did Angelo San Giacomo end up becoming? He ended up becoming what I always called the Donald Trump of San Francisco, which means he did things exactly the way he wanted. So when he wanted to raise money, he would just go raise the rents. Would the papers attack him for his rate increases? Yes, they would. But Angelo kind of knew how to play the game. So what he would do is, he would raise the rents. The papers would denounce him. The politicians would denounce him. He'd call the politicians in, offer to donate to their campaigns, maybe throw in, hey, what if I put a playground on this spot of land I own in San Francisco? Would that shut you down from all that criticism? And of course, it did. So what I saw very early on was Angelo doing pretty much whatever the hell he wanted, even though the local Democratic politicians would criticize him for it. And it was not something that would last for a long time. So I'd seen this game before. So when Trump came on the scene, I watched him act and say many of the same things that I'd heard Angelo San Giacomo say over the years, which is that don't get too worked up about politicians. They're all prostitutes of one form or another. And some of the most effective things that Trump had said during the 2016 election is, yeah, I know all these politicians. I donated to them. And when Hillary tried to come after him in one of their debates, saying, you haven't paid your taxes in X number of years, and because you had this big write-off. And Trump responded, yeah, you're right. I do the same thing all your donors do. And that was kind of a shocking thing to be said, because up until that time, all of the politicians were supposed to give this false virtue kind of thing. So Trump just didn't do that. So Trump has been an individualist. He has developed a sense about people, which I think is probably among the best people radar of anybody on the planet. And then he figures out what to do. So how did this serve Trump, and how did it also hurt him? So I have always argued that Trump is not a crazy person. He's kind of, I would say, as a CEO, he's kind of I kind of put him like a 70 to 80% change maker CEO, which means he's going to see when he can make good changes that won't come back and bite him on the ass. So the press will think he's a crazy person because he says a lot of things that they think is crazy, they think are crazy, but he's testing the waters. It's sort of his sounding board. He wants to see what comes back from his comments. So he might say things like, why do we need nuclear weapons? Why do we need NATO? It's not because he's saying he thinks we should get rid of those things, although that's what the professional politicians will say. Oh my God, he wants to do this. He's asking them, give me the good justification. So if you understand that Trump is a cautious CEO, but one who will make changes, suddenly he makes a lot more sense. There's a story I've always liked about Trump, which is in 2015, he was talking to Newt Gingrich about running for president. And this is one of the things that is also a hallmark of a person who's a good CEO. They talk to the smartest people. Newt Gingrich is one of the smartest people we've had in politics in the past half century. So Trump had asked Gingrich, how much will it cost for me to run for president? And Gingrich responded, well, to win the Republican nomination, I think it's probably about $50 to $60 million. Trump thought about that for a moment and he said, oh, about the price of a yacht. That's the way he thought of it. Because when you have $2 to $3 billion, $50 to $60 million is what you might spend on a yacht. So notice, he's not putting his entire fortune at risk. He's just making a calculated gamble that maybe I can win this thing. If I do, great. If not, my reputation will be even higher. And so I think that that is the way that you should look at Trump. He's a calculated risk taker who will talk to a lot of people before he makes up his mind. And he'll ask provocative questions because he wants to hear all the arguments. If you think of Trump like that, then you can pretty much predict what he's going to do. So let's look at Trump's first terms and the mistakes he made. I think that one of the things that probably shocked Trump during his first term is how incompetent the political class was. He really tried to get the best people, but the deep state really didn't want Trump to succeed. I think that they were surprised that he won. So a lot of the people that he got were not the all-stars, and they were also not people who were aligned with him. And so, like a real estate person with properties, he's looking what he can do. Now, I find it really interesting what Glenn Beck, the argument that Glenn Beck is making these days. So Glenn Beck is making the argument that in Trump's first term, you should look at what he did with our country like a building which had a leak in the basement. And what Trump did was he taped up the leak, drained the basement, and then tried to, make things work. And he did. He really was heading towards re-election before COVID-19 hit. Now, I've gone over my ideas about COVID-19, that it was an engineered virus done through gain of function research, sponsored by Tony Fauci and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Yes, so I've said all that. I don't know if it was accidental or intentional. I think there's some good circumstantial evidence that it was intentional, but that's not proven. But let's just go on. So that first term, he was handicapped first by Russia collusion, then by not having good people in the top positions because he had a limited pool, and then by COVID-19. So Trump did amazing things during his first term, but he was handicapped by a lot of things. So he spends 4 years in the wilderness, sees how much they want to destroy him. I've heard claims that up to $500 million has been spent by Trump defending all the legal actions against him. I'm not sure that's true. I would think that it's much less, but maybe there's been some substantial financial harm done to Trump between 2021 and 2024. So then he wins the presidency again. Now he understands the position he's in. So Trump is innately cautious, but he will take calculated risks. So the argument that Glenn Beck is making, which I think makes a great deal of sense, is that now Trump understands the enemy. He understands they don't want any change. And so, what are the changes that Trump needs to make? Well, first of all, there's been a river of dark money going to liberal groups to destabilize the United States. That was the whole thing about the NGOs and that money coming from the State Department. So he cut off the money flow. Then what he's doing is he's making sure our military is strong, and he's purging the intelligence agencies, which have caused so much trouble. What are some of the things that he does that make members of his base wonder if he has been compromised? Well, on the Epstein issue, he wants to move on from the Epstein issue. And a lot of people had trouble with that. But since I've written about that for my new book, I have kind of a different perspective. My perspective is that Epstein kind of got his wings clipped in 2008. And then he started trying to work through the universities. So that's where he was doing a bunch of his mischief in the years after that 2008 Florida conviction. What that means is that the file on Epstein was held by the bad guys for, 2008 to 2020, 12 years. So do you think in that period of time, they were able to sanitize the files? Yeah. Are we going to find any smoking guns in it? Probably not. There are probably going to be some things left in it, which will point us in certain directions. But it's a bit of a shit show. The other thing that's a shit show about the Epstein files is that for a period of time, the Justice Department said anybody who has a claim against Jeffrey Epstein, here's this number for you to put in your information. Well, here's the problem with that. There are a lot of crazy people out there. Let me tell you an example. So I've written a lot about the MK Ultra program initiated by the CIA, which was designed to create an assassin who would have no memory of what they had done, as well as ways to influence the public in ways that they wouldn't know. So MK Ultra is a very real thing. However, one of the number one complaints of mental patients is that they believe the CIA is secretly manipulating them. I haven't seen any good evidence that that is currently happening. I think the great majority of those with mental illnesses today do not have secret receivers implanted into their dental work. So both things are equally true. The Epstein case is just like that. So, what are you going to do? What are you going to do when there's a bunch of garbage in the Epstein files? What is some of the garbage that they have? Well, there's this one account, which I'm sure all of the mainstream media would go crazy about, which is Jay-Z gets on an Epstein boat and then he starts abusing kids. And so you're thinking, oh, okay, it's a Jay-Z story. And then Bill Clinton shows up and Bill Clinton starts having sex with minors. And then President George H.W. Bush shows up, starts abusing kids, and then they start sacrificing babies and cooking them up to eat. Now, do I believe a lot of bad things about Jeffrey Epstein? Yeah, he was a total creep. Do I think Epstein had on his boat Jay-Z, Bill Clinton, and President George H.W. Bush, and they cooked up babies? No, I don't. But that's the kind of shit that you got. So Trump is trying to figure out, how do I fix these things? How do I take what is genuinely wrong and separate it from that stuff which is batshit crazy? That's the task that he does with a news media which is not interested in reporting the truth. So Trump did an interview with Glenn Beck the other day, only about 10, 15 minutes, but I thought it was really great because Trump demonstrated his command of the situation. And he did it showing you that even though he's president of the United States, he's not a know-it-all. And he's very comfortable with not knowing things. So first thing that they talked about was they talked about Iran and the ongoing war there. Trump pointed out correctly that in all significant ways, the Iranian military has been defeated, but that they still can't get the Iranians to come to the table, and they're moving towards economic warfare, which seems to be having a significant effect. When is that going to get solved? I don't know, but I believe it will get solved, and it'll get solved to our satisfaction, and Iran will cease to be a source of instability in the Middle East, and the other Arab countries can actually work with Israel, which I think would be a great thing for the world. So he's doing that, and he knows it's going to take a little bit of time, and that's okay. We've also got the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, going over to Russia. So that's an interesting story. And the question is, what's going on? The news media reports are that he's going there because Putin's planning to do something terrible and he's telling them, don't do that. I don't know, maybe so. But, if that's true, you got to keep that shit quiet. And so Trump kind of brushes it off. So I kind of listen to that. I go, okay, maybe yes, maybe no. Do we know if Putin is planning to do anything? Is that like a 5% chance? Is that a 40% chance? We may not know. Sometimes your intelligence is not that good. But here's there were two more examples in that wonderful interview with Glenn Beck that I just felt like I was back listening to somebody like Angelo San Giacomo. Because if you want to be a good leader, you got to be really clear on what you know and what you don't know. So one of the questions that Glenn Beck brought up was this question of Sharia law. Now, in England, it seems like there's a big question, or there's a big problem with a number of Muslims and the Muslim majority areas, and some of them being run effectively under Sharia law. I'm not going to tell you I understand all of that, but at least that seems to be fairly clear that there are some instances of that in Great Britain. And so Glenn Beck asks Trump about that in the United States, and Trump kind of brushes it off and he goes, well, not really a problem in our country, but if it did become a problem, sure, I'd sign an executive order prohibiting Sharia law. And, you could just kind of see the wheels turning in Trump's head. And he's like, well, okay, well, maybe that would be a good thing for me to do proactively. It's not much of a problem, doesn't cost me much, probably makes everybody feel better if they know that there's an executive order against Sharia law. Maybe I can get the Democrats to do another stupid thing and oppose me on outlawing Sharia law in the United States. So, yeah, okay, maybe I'll do it. Okay, the next thing is Glenn Beck talks about having his own cattle ranch and the problem he's having with packaging and the fact that the Biden administration did a number of things that negatively, in fact, impacted the beef market. And so, Trump knows there's a problem with the supply of beef in this country. So on the show, Trump asks Glenn Beck, so what would you have me do? Who should I talk to? And you can just see that Glenn Beck is a little taken aback, like, the president is asking my advice on a national interview? Sure. Well, I think it's the FDA. It might be the Department of Agriculture. And Glenn Beck doesn't quite know. And so Trump's like, oh, okay, great. And you think that this will really, change the situation with our beef problem? Oh, yes, Mr. President, that will really affect things very well. Again, that's the way a landlord views the world. The landlord views the world and says, okay, what's the problem? Can you tell me what the problem is? Can you tell me the size of the problem? Okay, now that I understand the size of the problem and where it is, what do you suggest I do to fix it? Oh, that's what you suggest I do to fix it? Okay, I'll go start talking to people and I'll start asking about that. So the Trump doctrine is that he wants to make sure that things are working well. When he identifies that things aren't working well, he calls in smart people and asks their opinion. If he keeps getting the same message time and time again, he'll say, oh, okay, all the smart people are saying the same thing. I know they didn't talk to each other, so maybe that's the smart play. So the Trump doctrine has remained the same, which is why I just really have to call out some of the former conservative commentators who suddenly seem to believe that Trump has changed. No, he hasn't. Trump is exactly the same. He's pivoting one way because he believes this is good. His inclination is not for war, but he sees how much of a continuing problem Iran is. Let's talk about Iran historically. What was Iran, through its proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah, responsible for? Well, blowing up the Marine barracks in Beirut during the Reagan administration, killing, I think, 285 of our soldiers. Was Iran behind a lot of the instability in Iraq? Yes, they were. Does Iran stir shit up? Yes, they do. Do they also want to build a nuclear bomb? Yes, they do. Do they want to have an amazing army of drones to cause problems in the Middle East? Yes, they do. Do they want to have intercontinental ballistic missiles so they can cause even more trouble? Yes, they do. Is the Iranian leadership dedicated to taking down the United States? Yeah, they are. Okay, I understand they may have some problems doing it, but isn't it better to solve that problem before it becomes a much larger problem? So I think this is the way Trump is going. I do not believe that Trump is being blackmailed. I do not believe he has suddenly become part of the establishment because he knows they hate him. He's in this job for you, the citizens, the tenants of the United States. He sees you living in the United States like the people living in one of his buildings. And he wants to make your life better because if your life is better, his life is better. I think Trump is setting himself up to be one of the great presidents in American history. It may take a couple years for the mainstream media bias to wash away from people's minds, but I think that we're going to look at the second term of President Trump's presidency as the golden age of American power and strength. And he's going to fix the problems which no other president has addressed in the past 40 or 50 years. So the Trump doctrine, take care of the people. If you don't see that's what he's doing and not listening to the chattering class, you're missing the entire show. That's all I have for you today. Hopefully, this has not been the best part of your day. Hopefully, the best part of your day is listening to those people in your life and having real relationships with people, not listening to some good looking, intelligent guy on the internet and saying, okay, I've had my social connection for the day. All right. Thanks a lot and have a great day, America.